I think people have forgotten that virginity in itself, whether kept through self control or just through the avoidance of women, is actually a virtue. I understand that most people who consider themselves to be incels don't want sex for sex's sake, and that they want a relationship. But I think that too many people view sex as the means to starting relationships. And honestly, I think an admirable quality of incels is that they've been able to retain that virginity, at least in a material sense. They've never had sex, which is a good thing. Not only does indulging in that kind of act have the potential to actively reduce your intellect, but also, because you still possess that, you still have a grand gift to give to your wife when you meet her. In fact, I think in many ways, incels are a lot like swans. Young swans are kind of notorious for being ugly, having these disgusting grey feathers, and they just completely contrast with everything around them because they're so abominable and despised by society. But if they make it to adulthood, if they make it to maturity, those grey feathers, they molt and they're replaced by a most beautiful and pure whiteness. That thing that makes the swans be those birds that are the only bird under the protection of the Queen in the UK. That brilliant whiteness that enlivens the environment among all manner of different birds amongst the ducks, that blend in amongst the coots and amongst the moorhens, which are often a very common sight. However, what this is contingent on is that the bird reaches maturity. It must stick by its mother, or it will be consumed by the foxes, or will be taken by the birds of prey. And we see this often amongst both the swans and the incels. So don't think that this cannot happen. And by this, I mean that consumption that can be had from the despondency, from the depression of being in the state of an incel. I understand fully that feeling, that burning, that burning on the brow, that constant depression of being alone. I think most people do, but I think that especially incels feel it. I think that especially you feel it. But I think what's often forgotten, as many are driven mad by their despair, is that this burning crown that you are forced to wear, this is a burning crown of gold. It is the forge in which you are formed. Many excellent men, St. John Chrysostom springs to mind, have said for thousands of years that despondency and depression are a fate worse than death. And as those men in society who feel it the most intently, I can promise you that that burning crown of gold, it will cool. It will cool, and it will be your crowning glory. It will be that marker to show that you have suffered with the worst thing that a human being can ever suffer from. But to do so, you must bear it as a man. You must not grimace. You must not shed tears. You must bear it and wait for it to cool. You cannot touch it with your hands. You cannot pull this crown off of you, for that is why it's there, because it is your crowning glory. A great man had this once. He was called Ezekiel. You might have heard of him. And Ezekiel was told by God that he was to have his wife killed. His wife taken from him, and his wife was his most honoured possession on this planet. He loved her dearly. But he wasn't allowed to cry. He wasn't allowed to shed a single tear for the sake of his most beloved. And you, although you may not see the beloved, you are in a similar situation. You suffer as he did. And to truly, truly nail this suffering with honour, you must stick close to your mother. You must be as the swan who sticks close to her mother to avoid the prowling of the fox. You must, in a certain sense, in order to stay within the good graces of that mother, the church, keep yourself pure. You must follow those rules that keep you close, In a similar way to how those of you who still have intact families follow certain rules in order to stay friends with your family. Because there are always contracts, and there are always rules in which to judge our ability to suffer as men. One of those things, even if a woman might reject you in the most horrendous way possible, is to never ever, ever fall into the trap of hating women. I see it a lot in people I know in real life, and especially with people online. A lot of men despair because they've been rejected, or they don't have the courage to talk to the woman they like. And that's a very human thing. We all see this. But often in our pain, often in the thorns that are poked into our hearts, we forget that the person driving the thorn in also is another human being with the same wounds, with the same pains, shedding the same tears in a different way. Those girls with nose rings, with coloured hair, wearing skimpy outfits, it's the same suffering. These girls think that by putting themselves out, that they will conquer in a certain way the loneliness and despondency within themselves. And I know a number of women, I'm thinking of one specifically, who was one of these women, and she was on a case of antidepressants that almost killed her. She was on so many antidepressants and it was so oversubscribed that it could have done her serious damage because of how she felt. And this is just the same as what incels feel, but implied in a different way. And I think perhaps because of the way that our hearts are hardened into steel and stone by our sufferings because we don't understand them in the correct way, I think that we forget that. In fact, I think one thing that will immediately diffuse any kind of attraction men have to pornography, something which is rife and people continually apologise for, in spite of the disgusting way that the actresses and the actors are treated, is remembering that on the other end of that camera is a human being, and many times they are slaves, either to their passions or quite literally. They don't last, they don't live lives that are fulfilling. And I think that a true disgust at that will kill that habit, because you can tell a man who has that habit. Women can tell very easily. And although they won't be able to articulate it, they certainly react when you quit. And believe me, you will sweat as you quit that. You will sweat for hours. It is not an easy habit to break by any means, and you can read a multitude of stories online about it. But it is something necessary. Conquering that weak man within you, and bringing out the strong. Bringing the new man to replace the old. Finally, never, ever, ever lose that gift of chastity. You may lose virginity within marriage, but never ever give up that gift of chastity, because it is a gift. St. John Chrysostom, in his letters to St. Olympia, praises this as the virtue of virtues. Abraham, Jacob, and Job, in spite of all being adamantine men in his words, did not retain their virginity. These men who we still talk about 3,000-4,000 years later, they had an iron grasp on that. And that's what made them great, as well as their appreciation of God, that particular virtue. Something I've noticed amongst people who aren't incels, or celibate in any way, is this weird inversion. It says in Ephesians chapter 5, as written by St. Paul, that wives are to obey their husbands, and husbands are to die for their wives on the cross. Now the rule is, man obey woman, and man nail his wife to the cross. That's all it is. Many men who are out there will do anything that a woman says, provided he can take her chastity. And that's truly a horrific thing, and it's predatory, frankly. It's no wonder women are unhappy, because so many men are these predators that will simp, but will never love, will acquiesce to their commands, but never truly adore that beauty that is present, for the sake of cummies, frankly. In fact, one thing I've heard from a lot of men who've brought this up to women is that they won't ever deny the commandment. They'll often deny the fact that the man is worthy in a certain sense. They'll attack the masculinity of the man who is asserting this. And they have a point. Men now are not men. They sit around on the chans or, heaven forbid, Reddit. They play video games. They don't exercise. They don't eat well. Why should a woman obey a man like that, who she knows for a fact would not even get up out of the chair to help her, let alone climb the sepulchre and be nailed up there for her sake? And one way of determining whether or not, in a sense, that you are worthy, that you would do that, is whether or not you would break the sixth commandment for the sake of a woman who is offering. And if you can say no, which for many men is a hard thing to do, I've never had an issue with it myself, with perhaps one exception. If you can do that, that's an indication that you are a man who is not ruled by pleasure. You're a man who can suffer, which is what this has all been about. This whole video has been about being able to suffer. And if you can indicate that, then a woman can trust in you. She knows that you will look after her. And so to conclude, hang tight and don't worry. Keep the commandments and you will be purified. Because there is no greater sense of a man than a man who can keep the basic commandments and suffer through anything for their sake. And that often wins the heart of a good woman. Because I think that's all ultimately incels want. They don't want this sex that is just everywhere. They don't want to go to a nightclub and just meet some girl and her be gone the next day. They want something lasting. They want someone who they can sit next to on the sofa, perhaps after a late night of watching movies, and stroke her hair past her ear, and know that they don't have to worry about where they'll be the next day. And one route to that, because it will never ever be like that all the time in a relationship. One route into that kind of relationship is demonstrating that you can suffer. And this is one of those crosses that you have been thrown. Do not take the burning crown off of your head. It is there to crown your glory. Thank you for watching.